It's day 10 since Russia invaded Ukraine and the humanitarian crisis is worsening. The US has urged South Africa to clarify its stance on the war in Ukraine, backing the European Union's push for President Cyril Ramaphosa's administration to take a harder line against the Russian incursion. South Africa's foreign ministry has urged Russia to immediately withdraw its forces and respect Ukraine's territorial integrity. But Ramaphosa has taken a different tack, saying US President Joe Biden should have agreed to an unconditional meeting with President Vladimir Putin to avert war and called for dialogue. To discuss this more, eNCA's US correspondent Simon Marks joins us now. Simon, before we discuss South Africa's stance on Ukraine, I want to find out from you what is the latest in terms of the planned ceasefire, which it appears that the Russian forces ignored, with shelling continuing around Mariupol. What's the situation at the moment?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. It's pretty evident that the ceasefire that was agreed by Russian and Ukrainian negotiators just a couple of days ago when they met on the border with Poland has not taken effect. It was designed to create a humanitarian corridor for refugees to leave Mariupol and the area around it down on the Black Sea coast, and for medical supplies and other humanitarian assistance to arrive in Ukraine. It was always going to be a big test, this, of the diplomacy that has been underway at a very limited and low level between the Russians and the Ukrainians, and it appears to have fallen at the first fence, with the Russians reportedly shelling some refugees who were attempting to leave Mariupol. The deputy mayor of the city has given interviews saying that citizens are being encouraged to try and seek safety wherever they can, but that safe haven is proving increasingly difficult to find. And all the signs today, again from Moscow, have only ratcheted up concerns here in Washington, D.C. President Vladimir Putin saying on Saturday that Western sanctions on Russia are, in his words, tantamount to a declaration of war. And he has also warned that any effort to impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine, that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is demanding, indeed repeated that demand in discussions today with members of the US Senate by video link from Kiev. The Russian leader saying any effort to impose a no-fly zone that would seek to ground Russian Air Force fighter jets that are dropping munitions on Ukraine will also be considered an expansion of the conflict. So for the Biden administration and governments across Europe and around the world, very challenging circumstances this, because President Biden is eager not to be drawn into conflict with Russia, especially given that the Russians have threatened to engage in a nuclear strike were the conflict to intensify, and yet the slope towards conflict with Russia is very, very slippery. So these are dangerous hours and days.
The falling flat of diplomacy, as you put it, is interesting because a call for diplomacy has been the only stance from the South African government to date. We're receiving a lot of criticism. How does the US feel about South Africa abstaining from that UN vote?
Well, with regard to diplomacy, I mean, I would say that the United States has maintained for days now that the window for diplomacy remains open. And indeed, if you listened to President Biden's State of the Union address, it didn't contain a single demand of Russian President Vladimir Putin. So the United States is saying that if the Russians want to engage in diplomacy, the US is ready to do so, despite the very challenging circumstances that would surround those conversations. With regards to South Africa, the United States is formulating the argument, along with its European allies and partners, that this is now a moment in history and that every country needs to decide which side of history they want to be on. President Biden portrays this conflict, this threat, to topple the elected government of President Volodymyr Zelensky in Ukraine as a proxy for what he argues is the battle that democracies need to wage for primacy in the 21st century over autocracies like Russia and China. Now, there's no question that the United States and the European Union will have taken note not just of South Africa's abstention at the UN General Assembly on that resolution condemning Russia a few days ago, but there were 35 countries in total that abstained on the resolution, including China, a couple of dozen countries across Africa, several countries in Latin America. And that is redolent of the fact that the Russians have, in many parts of the world, engaged in substantial amounts of diplomacy and outreach over the course of the last 20 years. And in some parts of the world, they have deep and abiding relationships with countries that are not yet ready to shred those relationships, which is why you've seen these abstentions taking place. But in the case of South Africa and other nations that the United States is putting pressure on, the US argues this is a simple equation. A country's territorial sovereignty, Ukraine's, has been pierced by a Russian army that the US argues is dropping cluster bombs and other banned munitions on civilian populations, targeting hospitals, apartment buildings, and seeking to topple the elected government in place in Kiev. And so the US argues this shouldn't be a tough decision for countries around the world to be making.
Simon, what's the US's reaction to the failure of that ceasefire?
Well, I think there'll be, to be honest, I don't think the US had very high hopes about that ceasefire. I mean, there are questions abiding here about why the Russian military onslaught of Ukraine appears to have stalled. There is that 40-mile-long military convoy that was heading towards Kiev, the capital, that has now remained stalled for the last 3 days. And the assumption that the Pentagon is drawing, and indeed a senior US official said today, is that something's gone wrong with that convoy, because it's unclear why it hasn't continued its advance to Kiev. There is only one major population center in Ukraine, the city of Kherson, that so far has fallen to Russian forces. There were, as you know, tremendous anxieties raised on Thursday night by the Russians shelling that nuclear power plant, which really raised anxieties about the prospects of some kind of unintended consequences. But the Americans are trying to figure out why the Russian advance appears to have slowed down, given that Vladimir Putin clearly thought this was going to be a much easier military campaign. And also, you know, we've seen massive civilian protests today in Kherson, the one city that has fallen to the Russians, raising the question of, even if Russia is able to topple the government of President Zelensky and take control of the country, how is it going to deal with the grinding civil war that would undoubtedly follow, given the absolute rejection of Russia's invasion by the vast majority of Ukrainians?
Language is very important in conflict situations like this. The US is saying it will defend every inch of NATO territory. What do we read into that?
Well, that there is a line, right? I mean, and the line is, if the Russians do anything to cross into NATO territory, attack NATO territory, even potentially launch a cyber assault on a government and its technology infrastructure, for example, in Poland or Romania, then under Article 5 of the NATO Charter, an attack on one country in NATO is perceived to be an attack on all countries in NATO, and all countries are committed to coming to the defence of the country that has been attacked. So the real risk here is that any kind of conflict between Russia and any NATO country, and there are several NATO countries that border Ukraine, then runs the risk of bringing American forces, European forces, NATO forces into that conflict. And that is the danger here, because there's every potential, with the Russian foreign minister now sanctioned, Sergei Lavrov, again warning this week that that would be the start of World War III, and the Russians would consider engaging their nuclear arsenal as a result of that. That's where things could really spin out of control. So I think what the Biden administration has been trying to do, and we've seen signals of this going back 10, 11 days now, is keep reiterating that NATO has no conflict with Russia, has no plans to go to war with Russia, that NATO is not implementing a no-fly zone over the skies of Ukraine, even though there's gathering pressure to do that, because Ukraine is not a NATO member and therefore is not covered by those defence covenants enshrined within the NATO Charter. The difficulty for Western policymakers in that is that the harrowing scenes that we've witnessed in Ukraine over the last few days may only intensify in the days ahead, and that could put added pressure on Western governments to take some kind of action in Ukraine, which would then mean all bets essentially are off.
So you talk about that line and any infraction into NATO territory resulting in what would essentially mean World War III for Europe. So we know the Pentagon has established a new hotline with Russia's Ministry of Defense to prevent miscalculations. Are they worried that a miscalculation or a military incident, unintended incident, spilling over the borders of the Ukraine into one of those NATO territories could unintentionally unleash what would be terrible?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and we saw that very clearly on Thursday night with the attack on the nuclear plant, and grave anxieties that then proved to be unfounded about whether one of the 6 nuclear reactors there was damaged. None of them was. The only building that was on fire was outside the nuclear plant's perimeter. But unintended consequences, and you're absolutely right, that hotline between the Pentagon and the Russian military, which has now been operational for 48 hours, is potentially very important. It is part of the Pentagon's efforts and the Russians' efforts at deconfliction, trying to avoid unintended consequences. But one of the issues that is concerning is that you're beginning to see a huge movement of people. So more than 1 million Ukrainians have already left Ukraine, and they're heading to all sorts of neighbouring countries, including Romania, Poland, the Baltic states. You're now also beginning to see the movement of people out of Russia. So there have been long queues today and yesterday of Russians trying to leave St. Petersburg and get to Helsinki, to Finland. And so this movement of populations has the potential to create added chaos. And imagine what would happen if, for example, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky did decide to evacuate Kiev and was given safe passage and sanctuary in a NATO country where he sought to set up a government in exile. That's one example of how the Russians and NATO could very, very easily find themselves in conflict. I mean, I think for the Biden administration and every government really, the question is unfortunately going to be, how far do you allow the Russians to take this campaign in Ukraine, and what happens if they then seek, as some have suggested, to expand it beyond Ukraine and try to recapture some territory, for example, in the former Soviet Republic of Moldova, which is believed to be an area that President Putin has been looking at. That's why this is so extraordinarily complicated, not just for the US government, but for all governments, including, of course, South Africa's.
And at the same time as those de-escalation and diplomacy efforts are underway, the US is also probing possible war crimes by Russia.
Yes. Now, it was very interesting, again, that the United States has kind of stepped back a little bit from that rhetoric. So the embassy in Kiev, the US embassy in Kiev, described on Twitter the shelling of the nuclear plant as a war crime. And then the State Department several hours later moved in to say to all of its other embassies around the world, do not retweet that message. We don't want that message going out that the United States considers that a war crime. Now, the US ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation said this week that every aspect of the Russian assault on Ukraine needs to be documented, because at some point there may be a referral to the authorities to investigate possible war crimes, and certainly non-governmental organizations, having seen the pictures of these cluster bombs being dropped on a hospital in the Ukrainian city of Chernihiv and other similar attacks, are already saying it's apparent that there should be war crimes charges levelled potentially against Vladimir Putin and members of his inner circle. But the US is being cautious about that. The US ambassador to the United Nations publicly urged Russian soldiers not to commit war crimes during her speech at the General Assembly this week, but the US is walking a careful line because, again, they're nervous about inflaming Vladimir Putin. I think they're nervous too here about whether Vladimir Putin is acting in a rational manner. There are many inside the administration and outside it here in Washington who believe that 2 years of COVID-19 isolation have badly impacted the Russian president's ability to understand other voices internationally and their concerns about what he's doing. So there really is an anxiety within the US government about the extent to which there is rationale governing the actions of the Russian leader.
Perhaps not the best time to poke the bear. Thank you very much, Simon Marks, for speaking to us. Simon Marks, eNCA correspondent in the US, speaking to us about ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine.